is going to be a 9 square mile area in Galilee where Jesus does about 90% of his miracles. I think Nixa is 14 square miles, if I remember correct. I'm the nerdy person that looks at numbers like that. I don't know why, it's just how I am. But in an area smaller than Nixa, Jesus did about 90% of his miracles. Galilee was an important area for Jesus' ministry. He did a lot of stuff there. He would go into Jerusalem for the festivals. He would interact with the leaders there. The leaders there would sometimes send out spies or observers to go figure out what's Jesus doing. But he spends a lot of his time in that area. And we read that he does that when his cousin John is arrested. Herod's fort prison out in the wilderness, and Jesus goes the opposite direction, but keeps sharing the same message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. And so in this area of Galilee, Jesus calls his disciples. So verse 18, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. And at once they left their nets and followed him. Anything interesting stand out to you in that? By the way, I'm not looking for a particular answer. Does anything interesting stand out to you in that? Anything you see in that interaction with Jesus? Yes? Yeah. He doesn't say a lot, does he? Just, So Jesus has several interactions with disciples and with fishermen at different times. In John's gospel ends with that. So the resurrection has happened, Jesus appears to them, they cast their nets over the other side of the boat, they catch all these fish, they know who he is. By the way, they're called fishermen. The Gospels never show the disciples catch a fish without the miraculous intervention of Jesus. That's the kind of fisher I am, by the way. I need that kind of interaction to help me these days. So, to answer your question, yes and no. The Gospel authors, we like to tell events. I hate to even use the word factually. We like security camera footage. We want to tell an event of okay, at this moment this happened, and then 30 seconds later this happened, and this. When ancients are telling you about somebody or about a situation, they're fine with combining a couple of stories. You know, the guy that had wooden teeth and chopped down a cherry tree. Anybody? George Washington. Okay? Are those two events combined? Did he have wooden teeth when he chopped down the cherry tree? Probably not, but I combined them, right? We know who they are. In a similar way, they felt fine with taking Jesus and kind of combining stuff. Luke has a sermon of Jesus. It's often referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. That's very similar to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. A lot of the same things are said. Did Jesus give two separate sermons in two separate locations that were similar? I think so. I mean, I sometimes will kind of re-preach a similar sermon in different contexts, and it's fine. It works, all right? Is it possible that Luke is borrowing some of the language from Matthew's sermon because it's really good and it makes the point that he's wanting to tell us about Jesus, and Jesus said it and we put it in the... It's equally possible. So, yes and sure. There are various instances where Jesus does that and does cause those miraculous catches, and it's with the same group of people. For Matthew's telling, it's just the word that makes him want to come. So you mentioned it's just a very short phrase. What would cause that short phrase to catch people's attention? There must be some sort of reputation about him as he's coming in there. and again, we can jump to other Gospels and we can think about other stories and whatever. Matthew has given us what Jesus has done to this point. So, and this is why I love for you to have a Bible in front of you. I'll come right back to you. If you look in Matthew's Gospel, at the beginning, you've got the genealogy. You've got the angel appearing to Joseph. You've got the wise men visiting. You've got an escape to Egypt. So Jesus isn't even an adult until chapter 3. And there what happens is he's baptized. John somehow, Holy Spirit, God's leading, John recognizes who he is. John tries to talk him out of baptism. Then you get the temptation in the wilderness. Then you get Jesus going around preaching, and now he calls disciples. What has he done that he can walk into the room and say one word, come follow me, and people just drop whatever they're doing and follow him?
So when we go back to Moses and the Pharaoh, God he pardoned Pharaoh's heart and whatnot, it almost seems like God would have some kind of convention on these two to, just put in, God, put all
Yeah. Yeah. Has God been working on them and kind of planting some things within them that when they see it, they're predisposed to go, yeah. It's quite possible. I think a lot of time, yes, sir. Go ahead.
Maybe it's not what he's done, who he is.
There's just something about him that when people see him and interact with him,
He is.
yeah, he is. I am, yeah. Yeah.
But this early on in his ministry, was he as well known as he is on the end of his ministry?
So this is where the Gospels share the story of Jesus just a little bit differently. Yes, Larry, I'll get to my statement in a minute, but go ahead.
The connection that comes to my mind is that story in John chapter 1 when he's introduced to, I guess it was Peter, Andrew, James, and John, was it those four, and he has it was Nathaniel, wasn't it, that he saw under the fig tree?
Under the fig tree, yeah.
And he tells him, I saw you there, and then they believed, and he said, you believe just because of that? You're going to see angels descending on the Son of Man. But anyway, they spent the day with him. So there's evidently some nurturing of that knowledge of Jesus from that time spent with him that made them say, hey, this guy is the chosen one, or this guy has something that he's going special he's going to do. And when they had a chance to be a part of it, there wasn't any hesitation.
And from John's Gospel, I 100% agree with you. What I like to try to do, there are books that are made called Harmonies of the Gospel, where they kind of tell you a story of Jesus that none of the Gospels tell you by putting them all in a blender and making them one. And so you'll read a little bit of Luke, and then John, and then Mark, and then Matthew, and then a little bit more of Luke, because Luke's longer, and then, and just, it creates a story, and it's helpful for some things. But I think our brains sometimes lose the message of each individual gospel when we instantly jump to other gospels and try to import it. Matthew's original readers, guess what they have? Matthew's gospel. That's it. So how are they going to learn about Jesus in this? And I guess I'm not asking a question well. What in that telling that Matthew has given us in this story, what might get Jesus the reputation? I'm going to follow that guy. Yes, sir.
Weren't most of the religious leaders of that time, they were really, if you weren't wealthy or had money or some kind of power or influence, they weren't really interested in you as a human being. And Jesus kind of had this reputation of hanging out with the prostitutes and the lowly. I even heard the shepherds referred to as like Hell's Angels or something, like tattooed
and pay them any kind of attention, right? Yeah. Absolutely. To kind of pick on the shepherds for just a minute. Couple weeks back, was that Christmas or Christmas Eve? Sometime around Christmas or Christmas Eve, we talked about that, and that Jesus interacts a lot with women and with shepherds. Those two groups couldn't testify in court in the first century. So if you're making up a story and you want good witnesses, you don't pick those people to bolster your story. And yet, it's the shepherds that announce his birth, and it's the women that do the resurrection. So yes, you're exactly right with the shepherds. Jesus is spending time with these other people. In Matthew's gospel so far, the really only ministry thing that we have seen Jesus do is he's going around preaching, repent. He's going around to the areas and he's calling people to repent. There must have been something in his preaching, who he's preaching to, how he's preaching, how he's interacting, that gets Jesus enough of a reputation that when these guys see somebody walk up, I can tell you, I can walk into any business in Nixa and I think if I just walked in and went, "Come follow me," and walked back out, most people go, yeah, I mean, you're laughing, right? What? Some strange guy just walking down the street? Come on! Just keep. We probably wouldn't do it, right? Okay? Now, if it's just some guy, Holy Spirit's not going to be nudging us going, you probably ought to listen to that guy. All right? But there must be something about him in the way that he's been preaching in these cities that's kind of gotten some stir, that when this religious leader comes and calls them, they're like, I'm not giving up on that opportunity, you bet. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder also the word about
Were people talking about his baptism?
hear God's oddity in heaven about someone.
Yeah.
Oh, I want to be around this guy.
Yeah, absolutely. The voice from heaven. That ought to get some attention, shouldn't it? Of course, there's a lot of things in Jesus' ministry that ought to get some attention, and people are just kind of like, yeah, oh well. Which makes me wonder, how much stuff do we miss every day? How much stuff do we miss God doing right in front of us, and we go, yep, whatever. Just move right on past it. We got our heads buried in our phones or in whatever else we're doing. Yeah, we miss it.
I almost wonder if they didn't quite, like when I think about Matthew writing this, I mean, he wasn't there. And so
At this point in the story, he's not there. You're right.
he was probably, to try to fill in the blanks a little bit, he was probably asking, Simon and everybody, like, hey, what happened? How did you hook up with this guy? And they wanted to look all awesome. They were like, oh yeah, he said, come on. I'm like, yeah, sure, let's go. It could just be, they're trying to make themselves look awesome and say, yeah, we can question anything.
Yeah. I think sometimes we read the Gospels way too sterilely. This is a holy text, and we need to look at it, and we need to frown a little bit and have a furrowed brow so that we approach it with reverence. You realize that John calls out Peter for being slow in running in his Gospel, right? These are human beings, and you see the personality come out in the different authors. So there may be something there. They're like, oh, we dropped our nets right away and went, yeah, okay, all right, I'll do you a solid and put that in, Sure. I still am fascinated by, again, if I could block out everything else I know about Jesus and just take what Matthew is telling me, maybe the baptism, maybe that's got some word around it, but he's going around preaching, and he's preaching a message that people are somehow responding to, somehow listening to the point where he can just say, come follow me, and people are dropping their business and going. And guess what Jesus is about to do in Matthew's gospel? Look down the page. What's the next big thing that Jesus is going to do in Matthew's gospel? He's going to preach to us. Maybe Matthew's building that anticipation of, man, I wish I could hear this guy preach. Oh, just get ready. We'll give it to you. Hang on. Yes, Larry.
I think it's stated at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught us one having authority and not as the scribes. And I think there's
Yeah.
I think people, that kind of came through people with somebody that, hey, he's called me to trust in him, or either go with that or not.
Yes, very much.
Would genealogy play into this credibility?
Different culture, I understand this. When people meet you, do they ask about your genealogy? Yeah, to the right people, maybe so. To people, well, but again, as you think about through the Gospels, there's different arguments made in different Gospels. And I think it's John's Gospel where they go, we don't even know who his parent, we don't even know who his father is, we don't even know who, we know who our father is, And so like they're already kind of casting shade on Jesus's virgin birth thing. Yeah, sure, Mary. That's kind of happening in the background in some of these Gospels. So, if he got up and said, here's my genealogy, he's not concerned with his earthly genealogy. He's concerned with his heavenly connection. Matthew is giving us the genealogy to those Jewish people who are really concerned about this. And he can't be the Messiah unless he's, okay, he is. Okay, all right, well, let's move on. Let's see if he acts like the Messiah. Because Jesus has other brothers. Jesus has cousins who could descend from that same line. That there's a number of people who could fit that. But they're not doing what Jesus is doing. Should have. It gets a little bit muddled. The records for all the genealogies that were so important to Israel that were kept in the temple were destroyed by Herod the Great. He was an interesting dude. He was a thug. He makes Al Capone look like Barney Fife. But, he was a thug, and one of the things he did is he went in there and found all those records and goes, you know what? People are going to be looking for that Messiah. Destroyed it all. So, anyway. But yes, is it the thing? No. Is it an important thing? Yes. But if somebody fits the genealogy and never does anything that looks messianic whatsoever, so yeah. So he calls Andrew and Peter. They're gone. They come. Verse 21. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So we get the same word. It's the same. Verse 20 says at once. Verse 22 says immediately. Same word. The response to all these guys is, yep. No hesitation. Going right now. And notice he calls fishermen first. Yes, fishers of men. I will send you out to fish for people, right? But their occupations, they're fishers, right? If you're starting a religious movement, if you're trying to change the world and influence people to believe a theological conclusion, is that your game plan? To go down to Table Rock Lake and find some people on the bass boat? Yeah, you look qualified to me. I'm in. I find this refreshing. I find it comforting, and I also find it challenging. That Jesus, I think sometimes we make it far more complicated than we have to. These guys got a basic education. They sort of washed out of the educational system, and they're learning their trade. You don't have to be an Ivy League scholar to be able to do the work of ministry. You don't. These guys spent time with Jesus, and it transformed their lives and changed the world. You want to be a part of that? Spend time with Jesus, and it'll transform your life and change the world. At the same time, God does also work through some of the scholars. Paul, trained under Gamaliel. Yep, he's got his Harvard degree. Paul does not write the majority of your New Testament, but he writes a lot of it. Luke actually technically beats him out on that. Luke in Acts is longer than all of Paul's writings on word count. Paul writes a lot. Paul does a lot. So God works through both. So what's challenging is I need to step up to the task. And I also need to realize that whatever camp I find myself in, God works through both camps. Let's find a way to spend time with Jesus so that we can go out and do the work that He's called us to. Yes, Larry?
Pretty much covered what I was going to comment about. I just think it seems like earthy people, just common laborers, people who are used to the realities of everyday life and survival, seem to pick up on the obvious truth a lot quicker than learned people.
Yeah. I can tell you at a previous congregation where we had a Celebrate Recovery ministry, we ended up looking at the end of one calendar year of all the baptisms that we had and all the people that we had reached for Christ. I'm not talking about people moving in, and transferring membership and all that sort of. I'm talking about people who did not walk with the Lord, didn't know Jesus, came to faith, were baptized, and were living the Christian life. And at the end of that year, 95% of those came from our Celebrate Recovery ministry. If you're building a religious team, common sense goes, you don't go over there. You go to the people who, kind of have it together. Which, by the way, none of us really have it all together. Play it well, right? It was amazing what God was doing through that. And I think you see a little bit of that here, too. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, so we also want to say God has a plan, but also His parent plan. So we also know God said, before you were born, I knew you. So each one of these people that is going to be His disciples, we assume they will be placed there, and each God already knows they've got there.
Mhm. Yeah.
Part of the master plan.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what that makes me think about is, what does God have me here for? He put them in a fishing boat to prepare them for ministry. What's He preparing me to do where I am right now? What around me is God kind of shining a light on, going, that's where I'm sending you. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking, it really is like the grunt workers that make the world go round. And then I was thinking, it could be as simple for them coming immediately as feeling chosen. To be a part of
Thank you.
amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Imagine, turn your way back clock to when you're finishing up schooling. You're thinking about, okay, what do I do from here? And you get, Harvard that's like, who are you? You don't even exist. You breathing the same air as me offends me. Get out of my space. That kind of stuff. That's kind of the religious leaders. Okay? What if all of a sudden Princeton starts, and I don't care anything about Princeton or Harvard, whatever. What if Princeton all of a sudden starts coming to where you are and going, come on. Come on. Well, I didn't apply. Doesn't matter. Come on. Come on. How would that make you feel? How would that hit you that an Ivy League school, regardless of what you've done in the past, regardless of what your teacher said, regardless of whatever, they're coming going, you can be one of us. Come on. Okay. Again, the scribes and the muckety-mucks, they would walk around with their followers. If people would come up to them and go, please, sir, may we study with you? You are a wise and learned person. God has blessed you. Go and serve Him elsewhere. In other words, I love you. Not here, though. Jesus is completely flipping that on his head. And He's going out and He's finding people going, come on, you can be like me. If He's the rabbi, if He's been going around and He's been teaching and He's been preaching, people are paying notice, and He comes up and He goes, you can be like me. That flips the world on its head. And He goes out and He doesn't find the elites, He finds the common folks and goes, you can be like me. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever your background is, whatever your education is, whatever your current profession is, Jesus says, you can be like me. Absolutely. Yes, sir. You know, we all have access to that, right? For those of you online, Mark said, I think he cheated and got the answer from his father. Sure. We should all prep for the test that way, right? Every single one of us should prep that way. Look down at verse 23. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among people. Now we start seeing the miracles creep in. But before this, we haven't had any, again, other than the fancy theological word is the theophany, where you hear the voice from heaven, the Father, you see the Spirit, and you see the Son. You see that kind of thing. Other than that, we haven't had any miraculous open signs yet. Now Jesus is going in, now he's preaching, and people are being healed, and people are being, all kinds of things happening. Verse 24, now news about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, more on that in a minute, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. Decapolis. Anybody know what Decapolis is? Think back to your root words. Deca. 10. Opolis. 10 cities. Very good. The 10 cities. What 10 cities? We could list out the 10 cities. We could give you the names. And it's like, okay, what about them? Those were Gentile cities. So already right here, news has spread in this backwoods area where we might run into Gentiles. We don't want to go there. And Jesus has crowds of the mucky-mucks from Jerusalem, of Gentiles. A very diverse group of people are following Jesus. And let's keep in mind, this is the one who is the blessing of Abraham to bless all people. And right here at the beginning, you have that representative sample of all these people following Jesus. He's relating to them all because that's what God has been after all the time. His goal has always been to work through Abraham's line, not to make them special, not because... Moses gives them a real pep talk in Deuteronomy by going, God didn't choose you because you were special. God didn't choose you because you were talented. God chose you because He loved you and wanted to love everybody else through you. If God's blessing is going to come into the world through a line, it has to go somewhere. The goal was not to elevate that one family. The goal was to use that family as a blessing for all. The problem that Israel ran into is that they didn't do this. They did this. P.S. Have you ever run into churches who are supposed to do this instead do this? We have the same tendency if we're not careful. But right here, you see that it's working. When Jesus goes and does the God stuff, and He's representing His Father, and He's shining His light, what happens? People are interested in this, and they start following Him. We'll see that crowd kind of morph as His ministry goes on. But it's an important concept here. Right from the beginning, there's this large group of people. Thoughts, questions, comments, ideas, rebuttals, arguments, random bits of trivia? Yes? How big are the crowds? It's a good question. At different parts in Jesus' ministry, we do get some numbers thrown out. I mean, He feeds thousands. And what I love, sometimes you'll run into people who go, there's no way. He didn't have a PA system. How do you preach to thousands? How do you? If you go back in the history of this country, I'm talking about the United States, in the early days of the frontier, you had these early preachers, George Whitefield being one of them. Looks like Whitefield if you ever see it, it's Whitefield. George Whitefield being one. Some of the Wesleys did this. They did outdoor preaching. And they would have 20, 25,000 people show up. And you think, there's no way you could get a crowd of people out there. Well, in our world, with all of our noise that we're so used to, maybe not. But if you've ever gotten out, and I mean out in the woods, out in the far off areas, sound carries differently. I saw a couple of archaeologists doing this experiment, and I'm turning the way back clock. You remember the story of David and Goliath? And there's the enemy's armies, and they're camped out on different mountains, and they're shouting insults to each other. If you go to those mountains and you look at them, it's like, people are a speck on that hill. How in the world could you communicate across there? Even today, with modern road noise, they've done this, they've tested, hop on YouTube, you can find examples of this. Somebody will go down to where Goliath and his henchmen were, and somebody will be up on the area where Israel and their camp would be, and you can go, hey! And even with highway traffic, you can hear the words come across clearly, because the area kind of creates this natural bowl of sound. The Hollywood Bowl, familiar with that? That whole theater was designed to transmit sound in an age when there wasn't PA systems readily available. Greek theaters, you go to the ancient ruins and you see these grand, Ephesus still has one, huge colosseum. Why were they designed that way? Well, one was to get the seating in, but number two was you got actors on a stage and they need to communicate. The person sitting way up there in the nosebleed section needs to get their money worth for their ticket. And the sound travels that way. The areas where Jesus is preaching and teaching, it forms a natural amphitheater. We read stories about Jesus, being pushed by the crowd, so he gets in a little fishing boat and they go out a little ways and he preaches out in the water to the crowds on the shore. Sound bounces off the water. Just echoes. So at times, I wouldn't be surprised if Jesus had 20-something thousand people there. When we're told he feeds the 5,000, we're also told we're only counting the guys. We're only counting the ugly ones. There were cute kids and women there too. So there are 5,000 ugly guys, and the Jewish family tends to have a lot of kids. How many people are there? Easily be 3 times that. So, yeah. Don't have a number here, but that's a pretty good sampling. Crowds, plural. A lot of people. Good question. Other thoughts, questions, ideas? Yeah.
Well, the Bible also says, as the Lord returns, the whole world will hear the trumpets. So, not to make whatever happens, whatever he wants to happen.
He absolutely can. One other comment on that sound travel thing. This Highway 14 out here, there's a fair amount of road noise. Trust me, I live right there. I hear the road noise, okay? There's a fair bit of road noise. We were in the front room of the house. It was back before the weather turned cold, fall. And I could have sworn I heard my kids just screaming bloody murder. Where are they? I thought, they're outside. Oh my goodness. I run outside on the front porch and I hear it again, but I see my kids and it's not coming from them. There's a spot on the front porch of the house over there that you can get, and you can look right down the power line that's cut through the OTC trail. OTC trail goes down and around across some water and then kind of goes back up behind some houses. You can see all the way down there in the backyard of those houses, and all the way down there, I could see these kids just screaming out there in the backyard, going, like that. And then you hear the sound across highway traffic coming all the way up that hill, all the way up there. Sound can travel. And if it's something like Jesus that's worth listening to, you better believe people are going to be quiet. Can you imagine what it would have been like, even on the nosebleed seats of Jesus' sermon? And Matthew gives us a front row seat in chapter 5. That's where we're going to be next week during our sermon time. This morning we're going to be in the temptation of Jesus, so it is coffee and refreshment time. Find somebody you don't know, shake a hand. Get to meet somebody. We'll gather back in here in about 15 minutes for our worship time. And then following second service, we have our congregational meeting in here. Members are going to be voting on budget for the coming year, three additional elders, and a bylaws amendment on how we fund missions, which will be discussed at that meeting. But thank you all for being here. fellowship, and then we'll worship together.